Sir, if we sing for you, could we have the leftover food?
A cold wind moved through the streets of Chicago that night. The kind of wind that cuts through thin clothes and reminds you how cruel winter can be to people who have nowhere to go. Snow drifted slowly beneath the yellow glow of streetlights, piling up along the sidewalks where footsteps had long since faded. Most people hurried past with their heads down, wrapped in thick coats, focused only on getting home to warm kitchens and comfortable beds. But just outside a brightly lit restaurant on Michigan Avenue, two small figures stood close together, trying to block the wind with their bodies. They were twin boys, no older than 10, their faces pale from the cold and their hands trembling as they held onto each other for warmth. Their jackets were thin and worn, the kind that had already lived through too many winters. Their shoes were barely holding together. And according to everything later reported about that night, the boys had not eaten a proper meal in 2 days. The restaurant behind them told a very different story. Through the tall glass windows, people inside laughed loudly over glasses of wine while a pianist played soft music in the corner. Plates of steak and roasted vegetables moved from kitchen to table, while waiters in black suits hurried across the floor carrying trays of food that could have fed those two boys for weeks. The smell alone drifted through the entrance each time the door opened, and for the twins standing outside, that smell was almost unbearable. Hunger has a strange way of sharpening every sense. It makes the warmth inside a building look brighter, the sound of laughter feel louder, and the sight of food become almost impossible to ignore. For several minutes the boys stood there watching the life they wished they could step into, unsure whether they should walk away or take the risk of going inside. People entering the restaurant noticed them, but said nothing. Some looked away quickly. Others pretended not to see them at all. It is a common moment in cities everywhere. A silent agreement between strangers to keep walking. But hunger does not wait for pride to make decisions. After a long moment, one of the boys finally reached for the door handle and slowly pushed it open. Warm air spilled out immediately, wrapping around them like a blanket. Conversations inside softened for a second as people noticed the sudden appearance of two small figures standing near the entrance. Snow melted from their hair onto the polished floor as they stepped forward, unsure where to go next. Heads turned slowly around the room. Some guests stared openly, others whispered to the person sitting beside them. In a place where people arrived in expensive coats and polished shoes, the presence of two thin boys in worn clothing felt almost out of place, like someone had accidentally brought the outside world into a room that was trying very hard to forget it existed. The restaurant manager noticed them almost immediately. He walked toward them with the firm expression of someone who had handled this situation before. His job was to keep the dining room comfortable for paying guests, and children wandering in from the cold did not usually fit into that plan. He stopped in front of them and spoke quietly but clearly.
I'm sorry, but you can't stay here.
The twins looked at each other for a moment, as if silently deciding who would speak first. Finally, the slightly taller boy stepped forward. His voice was soft and careful, the kind of voice someone uses when they know they might be turned away at any moment. He looked up at the manager and said something that many people in that room would later remember word for word. He said,
Sir, if we sing for you, could we have the leftover food?
For a second the room was silent, as if no one quite understood what they had just heard. Then laughter spread across the restaurant. Some guests chuckled into their glasses, while others laughed openly at the idea of two hungry children offering a performance in exchange for scraps from the kitchen. One man leaned back in his chair and shouted across the room, "Yeah, kid, give us a show." Another person raised a phone to record the moment, expecting something amusing they could share later. To many people, it looked like a strange little interruption in their evening, something they would laugh about and forget before dessert arrived. The manager hesitated for a moment, unsure whether to send the boys away or let the situation play out. Finally, he shrugged and nodded toward the small piano near the wall, the one the restaurant musician had been using earlier. A few people clapped sarcastically, encouraging the boys as if they were part of the evening's entertainment. What no one in that room expected was what would happen less than 30 seconds later. Because when the twins opened their mouths to sing, something changed. The laughter faded almost instantly. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. Even the pianist who had been sitting nearby turned slowly in his chair to listen. The sound that filled the restaurant was not the shaky voice of frightened children trying to earn a meal. It was clear and steady and carried a harmony so natural that people began to look at each other in confusion. The two boys who had just been laughed at were singing with a control and emotion that did not match their age or their appearance. The room that had been full of noise only moments before grew so quiet that the clink of a fork against a plate sounded loud. But what none of those diners realized in that moment was that someone sitting quietly in the corner had stopped eating and was watching the boys very closely. Unlike the others, he had not laughed when the twins first spoke to the manager. He had simply observed them, listening carefully as if he recognized something others did not. By the end of that night, that man would make a decision that would change the direction of those boys' lives forever. But the story of how two hungry children ended up standing inside that restaurant begins long before that winter evening in Chicago. To understand why they were willing to sing for leftover food, we have to go back several years, to a small neighborhood where their lives once looked very different. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you, and don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. The restaurant slowly returned to its usual rhythm after the twins finished singing, but something had shifted in the room. The laughter that had greeted them at the door had disappeared, replaced by quiet murmurs and thoughtful glances between strangers who were now trying to understand what they had just heard. Two boys who had walked in from the freezing streets asking for leftover food had somehow managed to silence an entire room filled with wealthy diners. That moment alone would have been unusual enough to remember, but the story that unfolded afterward would leave an even deeper mark on everyone who witnessed it. Because as people began whispering to one another, and some quietly applauded, there was still one person in that restaurant who had not said a single word. Sitting in the back corner, partially hidden behind a tall glass of water and a plate that had long gone untouched, was a man who had been watching the twins from the moment they stepped inside. Most people in the restaurant were too busy reacting to the boys singing to notice him, but his attention never wavered. While others had laughed when the boys asked to sing for food, he had remained still, studying the way they stood beside each other, the way they breathed before the first note, and the way their voices blended together as if they had spent years practicing something far beyond a simple street performance. The man's expression was calm but focused, the kind of look someone gives when they recognize something rare. It was not the reaction of someone hearing a funny interruption during dinner. It was the reaction of someone who understood music deeply enough to know when he was hearing something extraordinary. And as the twins finished their song and the room slowly filled with quiet conversation again, the man leaned slightly forward in his chair, as though he was already thinking about what to do next. For the other guests, the moment was surprising but temporary. Within minutes, waiters began clearing plates again, and the pianist returned to playing soft background music. But the man in the corner continued watching the twins as the manager spoke to them near the entrance. Something about the boys had captured his full attention, and those who later heard the story would eventually learn that his decision that night would travel far beyond that restaurant. In the days and weeks that followed, his name would appear in newspapers, and people across the country would talk about the moment two hungry children walked into a restaurant asking for scraps of food and ended up changing their future in a way no one could have expected. Yet at that moment, none of the guests sitting around polished tables knew any of that. To them, the twins were still just two small figures standing near the door, thin from hunger and shivering from the cold they had carried inside with them. That is where the real mystery begins. Who were these boys who had wandered into a Chicago restaurant on a freezing night with nothing but a request for food and a voice strong enough to stop a room full of strangers in their tracks? Where had they learned to sing with such control and harmony when their appearance suggested a life far removed from music lessons or comfortable homes? And perhaps most puzzling of all, how had they ended up standing alone on the streets in the middle of winter in the first place? People in that restaurant could see their worn jackets and their tired faces, but none of them knew the path that had led those children there. They did not know the years of quiet struggle that came before that moment, or the small decisions that slowly pushed the twins closer to a life without shelter. There was also the question of the man sitting in the corner, the one person in the room who had not laughed at the boys when they first spoke. While others treated the moment as entertainment, he had been listening with the attention of someone evaluating something far more important. By the end of that evening, He would walk across the restaurant floor and speak to the twins directly. The conversation that followed would set off a chain of events that no one in that room could have imagined. It would bring reporters asking questions, cameras appearing outside buildings that had once been quiet, and a story that would soon travel well beyond Chicago. But at that point in time, those future headlines did not exist yet. The twins were still just two hungry boys standing near the door, unsure of what would happen next. To understand how they arrived at that moment, we need to step away from the bright lights of that restaurant and travel back several years, long before the cold wind of that Chicago winter night. Long before strangers would stare at them across expensive tables and wonder where they had come from. Their story begins in a very different place. In a neighborhood where the sound of music once filled a small home, and two young brothers discovered that their voices could blend together in a way that surprised even the people who knew them best. That is where we will begin, because before those twins became the boys who sang for leftover food in a restaurant, they were simply two children growing up in a world that once felt safe and ordinary. Long before Daniel and David Carter ever stepped into that restaurant in Chicago, their lives looked very different. The twins were born in Detroit, in a quiet neighborhood where the streets were lined with modest homes and neighbors knew each other by name. From the beginning, Daniel and David shared the kind of bond that only identical twins seem to understand. They moved together, spoke in the same rhythm, and often finished each other's sentences before the other had the chance. Their parents used to joke that raising them felt like watching one soul live in two bodies. In those early years, the Carter home was not wealthy, but it was filled with something far more valuable than money. It was filled with music. Their mother, Grace Carter, was known throughout their small community for her voice. Every Sunday morning she stood in the front row of the church choir, her voice lifting above the others in a way that made people pause and listen. Music for her was more than a hobby. It was a way of expressing hope, gratitude, and sometimes the quiet struggles that words alone could not explain. Daniel and David grew up watching their mother sing. At first they sat beside their father in the wooden pews, their small feet dangling above the floor while they listened to the choir. But it didn't take long before Grace noticed something unusual about her sons. Even before they could read the hymn books, they were humming along with the melodies. By the time they were 6 years old, they could follow the harmonies of songs they had only heard a few times. Their mother began practicing with them at home in the evenings. The living room of their small house often turned into a place where voices echoed against the walls while neighbors walking past the open windows slowed down to listen. Daniel's voice carried a warm and steady tone, while David's voice floated slightly higher, and together they created a harmony that felt effortless. People at church started noticing it too. After services, members of the congregation would stop Grace to tell her how remarkable it was to hear such young boys sing with that kind of balance and control. Soon the twins were standing beside their mother in the choir loft every Sunday morning. At first they were shy, holding onto the edges of their music sheets and glancing nervously at the rows of people sitting below. But as the weeks passed, their confidence grew. The congregation began to look forward to hearing them sing. Some older members even said the twins reminded them of gospel duets they had heard decades earlier. It became common to hear someone whisper after a service, "Those boys were born with music in their bones." Their father, Michael Carter, often stood near the back of the church watching proudly. Michael worked long hours in construction, building, and repairing structures across Detroit. His job was physically demanding, and many evenings he returned home tired and covered in dust. But no matter how exhausting the day had been, he never missed an opportunity to hear his sons sing. On Sunday afternoons, he would sit in the kitchen while Grace prepared dinner, asking the boys to perform the songs they had practiced that week. The house filled with laughter when Daniel tried to imitate his mother's powerful notes, or when David exaggerated a dramatic ending to make his father laugh. For a while, life in the Carter household followed a rhythm that felt steady and predictable. Michael left early each morning for work. Grace practiced music and helped at the church, and the twins spent their days at school before returning home to evenings filled with singing. They were not rich, but they were surrounded by warmth, encouragement, and a sense that their future held possibilities. Their mother believed deeply in the power of music to shape a life, and she often reminded the boys that a voice could carry hope even in difficult moments. Daniel and David listened carefully whenever she said that. At the time, Those words sounded like simple advice from a loving parent. None of them realized how important those lessons would become in the years ahead. But life does not always follow the plans we imagine. Sometimes a single morning can quietly change everything. For the Carter family, that morning began like many others. The sun had barely risen when Michael Carter finished his coffee at the kitchen table and prepared to leave for work. Grace reminded him to drive carefully, and the twins rushed to hug him before he walked out the door. It was a small moment, the kind that happens in countless homes every day without anyone thinking much about it. Michael smiled at his sons and promised he would be back in time to hear them practice a new song their mother had been teaching them. Then he stepped outside and headed toward the construction site where he had been working for several weeks. The twins watched from the front window as his truck disappeared down the street. That was the last time Daniel and David saw their father leave the house. Hours later, something happened at the construction site that no one in the Carter family could have prepared for. The details would reach their home slowly, first as a phone call that Grace answered with a confused expression, then as a quiet conversation that lasted longer than expected. By the time she hung up the phone, the room felt different. Daniel and David noticed the way their mother's hands trembled slightly as she sat down at the table. They were too young to fully understand what was happening, but they could sense that something serious had occurred. Outside, the day continued as normal. Cars passed down the street and neighbors walked their dogs, unaware that inside the Carter home a moment of devastating news had just arrived. That afternoon would mark the beginning of a chapter in the twins' lives that none of them had imagined, because the father who had promised to return home that evening would never walk through that door again. The news about Michael Carter's accident reached the Carter home later that afternoon, carried through a quiet voice on the telephone that Grace Carter would remember for the rest of her life. The words were careful and measured, the kind people use when they know they are delivering something that cannot be taken back. A structural beam had shifted unexpectedly at the construction site. Workers had tried to react quickly, but the accident happened too fast. By the time emergency crews arrived, Michael Carter was already gone. For a long moment after the call ended, Grace sat in silence at the kitchen table while Daniel and David watched her from across the room. The twins did not fully understand what had happened yet, but they could see the change in their mother's face. Something had broken inside her in that instant, something deeper than words could explain. When she finally looked up at the boys, her eyes were filled with tears she could no longer hide. That was the moment the twins realized their father was never coming home again. In the weeks that followed, the Carter household began to change in ways that were slow but impossible to ignore. At first, the community around them tried to help. Members of the church brought food, neighbors stopped by with quiet words of comfort, and Grace's choir friends offered to cover some of the bills. But grief has a way of stretching far beyond the first wave of sympathy. After the funeral, life continued moving forward for everyone else. While Grace struggled to keep up with the responsibilities that Michael had once carried so easily. Construction had been the family's main source of income, and without it the financial pressure grew quickly. Letters began arriving in the mail with bold writing across the envelopes. Utility notices, overdue payments, reminders that the mortgage had not been paid on time. Grace tried to manage everything herself, but the weight of loss made even simple decisions feel overwhelming. Daniel and David noticed the difference almost immediately. Their mother, who once filled the house with music, now spent long hours sitting quietly at the kitchen table staring at papers she barely seemed able to read. The piano in the living room remained closed more often than not. Even Sundays at church became harder. Grace still stood with the choir, but the confidence in her voice had faded. Sometimes she would stop singing halfway through a song and step away quietly, unable to continue. The twins did their best to support her in the small ways children understand. They kept their voices gentle around the house and practiced their harmonies without asking for much attention. But even their singing could not repair the growing cracks in the family's stability. As the months passed, the financial pressure intensified. Without Michael's income, the savings the family once relied on slowly disappeared. The bank notices became more urgent. Eventually, the day arrived when Grace had to face the reality she had been trying to delay. The house where Daniel and David had grown up, the home where their voices had once echoed through the living room every evening, would no longer belong to them. The twins did not fully grasp what losing the house meant until the day a moving truck arrived and strangers began carrying their furniture outside. Their small bedroom, once filled with posters and schoolbooks, was emptied piece by piece. When the truck finally drove away, the Carter family left behind not just a building, but the last place that still felt connected to the life they once had. From that point forward, stability became harder to find. Grace and the boys moved from one temporary place to another, staying with distant relatives for short periods and occasionally sleeping in shelters when no other option was available. Each move meant new surroundings, new faces, and the quiet uncertainty of not knowing how long they would be allowed to stay. For Daniel and David, school became difficult to keep up with as their lives shifted from one location to the next. The routines they once relied on slowly disappeared, replaced by the constant need to adapt to wherever they found themselves sleeping that night. Grace tried to remain strong for her sons, but the grief she carried had not faded with time. Instead, it seemed to grow heavier with each passing month. The woman who once filled church halls with confident music now spoke less and less. She stopped attending choir practice. The piano that had been part of her life since childhood remained silent. Even simple conversations with her sons became shorter, as if she no longer had the energy to keep pretending that everything would be all right. Daniel and David sensed the change, though they did not fully understand it. They could see their mother slipping further into her own thoughts, retreating from the world that once meant so much to her. Then one morning something happened that would leave the twins completely alone. Daniel woke first, as he often did, and noticed that the small room they were staying in felt unusually quiet. He assumed their mother had stepped out for a moment, perhaps to speak with someone at the shelter or to find breakfast nearby. But as the morning hours passed, it became clear that Grace Carter was not returning. Her few belongings were gone. The small bag she carried everywhere had disappeared along with her coat. There was no note left behind on the table, no message explaining where she had gone or when she might come back. Daniel searched the hallway and asked the shelter staff if they had seen her, but no one had any answers. David joined him outside, scanning the street with the hopeful expression of someone expecting to see a familiar face around the corner. But Grace Carter never returned. There was no goodbye, no explanation, just an empty space where their mother had once been, leaving two 10-year-old boys to face the world on their own. For children who had already lost their father, the silence that followed felt even more confusing. At first they believed she would come back the next day. When that did not happen, they waited another day, and then another. Eventually the truth became impossible to ignore. Whatever had driven their mother away had taken her far enough that she was no longer part of their daily lives. For Daniel and David, the days that followed were filled with uncertainty. Without parents to guide them, every decision suddenly mattered in ways they had never experienced before. They were still children, but the world around them no longer treated them that way. Yet even in the middle of that loneliness, the twins still carried one piece of their old life with them. It was not money, or a home, or the security they once knew. It was something far simpler, something their mother had given them long before their world began to fall apart. Because despite everything they had lost, Daniel and David Carter still had the one thing that had always connected their family together. They still had music. After their mother disappeared, Daniel and David Carter faced a reality no child should ever have to experience. At 10 years old, the twins suddenly found themselves navigating a world that expected them to behave like adults while still carrying the fears and confusion of children. The first few days were the hardest. They waited in places they thought their mother might return to, hoping each passing hour would bring her back. But as the days turned into weeks, it became clear that the life they once knew had completely disappeared. With no permanent home and no one to guide them, Daniel and David had to figure out how to survive using the only skills they truly understood. For a while, the twins moved through different parts of Detroit, staying wherever they could find temporary shelter. Sometimes they slept in the corners of public buildings that stayed open late. Other nights, they found empty spaces where they could rest without being noticed. Hunger quickly became the most constant problem they faced. Without money or reliable meals, they spent their days searching for ways to earn enough to eat. It was during those long, uncertain afternoons that Daniel remembered something their mother had always told them. She used to say that a voice could carry hope even when everything else felt lost. The twins began thinking about the one thing they still had that could possibly help them survive. They still had their voices. At first, the idea seemed frightening. Singing in church had always been comfortable because they stood beside their mother and faced people who already cared about them. But standing alone in public spaces where strangers rushed past without noticing them was very different. Still, hunger leaves little room for hesitation. One afternoon, Daniel and David walked to a busy street corner where people gathered near a bus stop. Cars moved slowly through traffic while pedestrians waited for the light to change. The twins stood quietly for a moment, exchanging a glance that only brothers who had grown up together could fully understand. Then they began to sing. Their voices rose gently at first, the same harmonies they had practiced years earlier in their living room back in Detroit. The sound carried through the air, blending with the noise of traffic and distant conversations. At first, most people walked past without paying attention. A few glanced briefly before continuing down the sidewalk. But after several minutes, something interesting began to happen. A woman waiting at the bus stop turned her head and listened more closely. A man standing nearby slowed his pace as he passed. By the time the twins finished their first song, someone had dropped a few coins into an empty cup Daniel had placed on the ground. It was not much, but it was enough to buy something small to eat. From that moment forward, singing became the twins' way of surviving. They discovered that certain places worked better than others. Busy subway entrances allowed their voices to echo through long hallways where people passing by could hear them clearly. Public parks during the afternoon brought families who sometimes paused long enough to listen. Street corners near restaurants often meant the smell of food drifted through the air, reminding them why they were standing there in the first place. Not every day brought success. Sometimes people ignored them completely. Other times someone would ask them to move along. But whenever someone stopped to listen, the twins sang with the same focus they once had in church. Each note carried the memory of the life they had lost and the quiet determination to keep going. At night, finding a place to sleep became the next challenge. Daniel and David searched for abandoned buildings or quiet corners where they could rest without attracting attention. Sometimes they found empty structures where broken windows let in cold air, but at least offered a roof above their heads. Other nights they stayed beneath bridges or inside doorways where the wind could not reach them as easily. The twins learned quickly how to stay close together for warmth. They shared whatever food they managed to collect during the day, always dividing it carefully so neither one would go without. In those quiet moments before sleep, they sometimes whispered about the songs their mother used to sing, repeating melodies softly so they would never forget them. As the months passed, the twins slowly adapted to the rhythm of life on the streets. Mornings meant searching for busy areas where they could sing. Afternoons meant counting coins and finding something to eat. Evenings meant finding shelter before darkness made everything more dangerous. Through it all, music remained the one constant in their lives. It gave them a reason to stand up each day and face whatever challenges waited outside. People who heard them sing often felt surprised by the strength of their voices, never realizing how much those voices meant to the boys themselves. Then winter arrived. For people with warm homes and heavy coats, winter is often just another season. But for children living on the streets, winter changes everything. The air grows sharper with every passing week, and the places that once felt manageable suddenly become dangerous. Cold winds move through abandoned buildings, making it nearly impossible to sleep without shivering. Public spaces grow quieter as fewer people stay outside long enough to hear anyone singing. Even finding food becomes more difficult as crowds thin and people hurry indoors. For Daniel and David, the season brought a new level of struggle they had never faced before. The twins did everything they could to keep singing despite the cold. Their voices sometimes trembled when the wind blew across open sidewalks, but they kept going because they knew stopping meant going hungry. They wrapped themselves in whatever clothing they could find and stayed close together as they moved from one location to another. Yet as the temperature continued to drop, survival became harder with each passing day. Some nights they could barely feel their hands by the time they found a place to rest. Other days the streets felt almost empty, leaving them with few opportunities to earn even a small amount of money. One night, the situation became more serious than anything they had faced before. The temperature dropped well below freezing, turning the streets into quiet paths of ice and snow. Wind moved through the city with a sharp edge that cut through their thin jackets, as if they were not wearing them at all. Daniel and David had spent the entire day trying to sing for passing strangers, but the cold kept most people indoors. By the time darkness settled across the city, the twins had collected almost nothing. Worse still, they had not eaten in 2 days. Hunger and exhaustion pressed heavily on them as they walked slowly through unfamiliar streets, searching for any place that might offer warmth or food. It was during that long, freezing night that the twins eventually reached the part of the city where a brightly lit restaurant stood glowing against the snow, a place filled with laughter, music, and warm meals waiting on polished tables. Neither of them knew it yet, but the decision they were about to make in that moment would soon change their lives forever. But the moment Daniel Carter and David Carter begin singing, something unexpected happens. The laughter fades, slowly, because the first note that leaves Daniel Carter's voice is not weak, it's not nervous, and it's definitely not the kind of voice people expected from a thin boy in worn-out clothes. It's strong, clear, and hauntingly beautiful, a sound so pure that it seems to float across the restaurant like a quiet wind. Then David Carter joins him, and suddenly, two voices become one harmony, perfectly matched, perfectly balanced, like they had been singing together their entire lives. Which, in truth, they had. The restaurant slowly begins to fall silent. A woman halfway across the room lowers her fork. A businessman stops mid-sentence. Even the bartender pauses while pouring a glass of wine. Because what they're hearing is something special, something rare, something powerful enough to stop an entire room of strangers. Daniel Carter sings the melody, his voice rising softly through the room. Then David Carter layers harmony underneath. The sound is warm, emotional, almost spiritual, the kind of harmony their mother once taught them every Sunday in church. And for the first time that night, no one is laughing anymore. People are staring, listening, trying to understand how two homeless boys could sound like this. Near the front table, a woman quietly wipes tears from her eyes. At another table, a man slowly sets his phone down. He had been about to record a joke. Now he just watches in silence. The manager who had mocked them earlier stands frozen beside the counter, his expression slowly changing, from annoyance to confusion, then something else, respect, because deep down, he knows what everyone else in that room is realizing. These boys are not ordinary. These boys are gifted. Daniel Carter closes his eyes as he sings the final verse. David Carter leans slightly toward him, their voices rising together in perfect harmony. Higher, stronger, fuller, and then, the final note fills the room. It lingers in the air for just a moment. Soft, beautiful, unforgettable. Then silence. Complete silence. For 3 long seconds. No one moves. No one speaks. Then suddenly, one person begins clapping. Slowly, softly. A single pair of hands. Then another. And another. Within seconds, the entire restaurant erupts into applause. People stand to their feet. Strangers cheering for two boys they had laughed at only minutes earlier. But in the far back corner of the room, one man has not joined the applause. He sits quietly, watching Daniel Carter and David Carter very carefully, his eyes focused, thoughtful, studying them in a way no one else in the restaurant is. Because while everyone else just heard a beautiful song, this man heard something different. Opportunity, potential, possibility. And by the end of that night, the decision he makes about Daniel Carter and David Carter will soon make national headlines. But at that moment, the twins are only thinking about one thing: food. The manager slowly approaches them again. This time, his voice sounds very different. "All right, boys," he says quietly. "You've earned your meal." The guests clap again. Some people even begin placing money on the table near the boys. Small bills, large bills, more than the twins have ever seen at one time. But the man in the back corner finally stands and begins walking toward Daniel Carter and David Carter. And what he says next will completely change the future of the Carter twins. The applause inside the restaurant continues for several long seconds. People who had never met Daniel Carter and David Carter only minutes earlier are now standing on their feet, clapping for two boys who walked in from the freezing Chicago streets asking for leftover food. Some guests exchange surprised glances. Others shake their heads slowly, still trying to understand what they just heard. Because talent like that, coming from children who look like they've slept outside for weeks, feels almost impossible. But while the crowd celebrates, Daniel Carter and David Carter simply stand there quietly. They aren't smiling the way people expect performers to smile after a show. They aren't bowing. They aren't soaking in the applause. They're just looking at the manager, waiting for the one thing they came inside for. Food. The manager clears his throat, slightly embarrassed by the way he treated them earlier. A few moments ago, he had wanted them out of the restaurant. Now the entire room is cheering for them. He turns toward the kitchen and calls out for a plate. Within minutes, a server brings out 2 warm dishes. Real meals. Steaming. Fresh. More food than the boys have seen in days. The manager places the plates in front of them and gestures toward a small, empty table near the entrance. "Go ahead, boys," he says. "Sit down and eat." For a moment, Daniel Carter and David Carter hesitate. Restaurants like this aren't places where boys like them usually sit down. But hunger wins again. They sit, and they begin eating carefully, not rushing, not grabbing, just slowly enjoying every bite. Across the room, several guests continue watching them. Some shake their heads with quiet disbelief. Others whisper to each other, "How are they homeless? Did you hear those harmonies? They sound like professionals." Phones that once came out to record a joke are now recording something else entirely. Something people want to remember. But at the back corner table, the man who had been watching from the beginning finally stands up. He hasn't clapped. He hasn't spoken. He hasn't taken out his phone like the others. Instead, he simply listened. Every note, every harmony, every breath between the voices of Daniel Carter and David Carter. The man begins walking slowly toward the twins. He's tall, well-dressed, probably in his early 50s. The kind of person who looks comfortable in a restaurant like this. But his attention is completely fixed on the 2 boys eating quietly at the table. As he approaches, the manager notices him immediately. His posture straightens. Because this man is not just another guest. People in the restaurant recognize him. Some whisper his name under their breath. Others look curious. Because the man walking toward the twins is someone who understands music better than almost anyone in the room. For years, he has worked behind the scenes of the music industry. He has discovered singers, produced records, helped launch careers, and he knows talent when he hears it. Real talent, rare talent, the kind that doesn't come around often. He stops beside the small table where Daniel Carter and David Carter are eating. The boys look up cautiously. They are used to adults approaching them with questions, sometimes kindness, sometimes suspicion, but the man's voice is calm, gentle. "What are your names?" he asks. Daniel Carter swallows a bite of food and answers first. "Daniel." Then he points to his brother. "And this is my brother David." The man nods slowly. "Daniel and David Carter," he repeats. He pulls out the empty chair across from them and sits down. The restaurant is quiet again now, guests pretending to return to their meals while secretly watching the conversation. The man leans slightly forward. "Where did you boys learn to sing like that?" The twins glance at each other. Then David Carter answers softly, "Our mom taught us." The man nods again. "And where is your mother now?" Neither boy answers immediately. Their eyes drop toward the table. Finally, Daniel Carter speaks. "We don't know." The man studies their faces carefully. The thin jackets, the tired eyes, the way they protect the food in front of them like it might disappear. He takes a slow breath. Then he asks another question. "Where do you boys sleep at night?" This time David Carter answers, "Wherever we can." The man leans back in his chair for a moment, thinking very carefully. Because in that short conversation, he has learned something important. Daniel Carter and David Carter are not just talented. They are alone, completely alone. And talent like theirs, left on the streets, rarely survives. It disappears, forgotten before the world ever has a chance to hear it. The man looks around the restaurant one more time. People watching, waiting, curious about what he will say next. Then he reaches into his coat pocket and pulls out a small business card. He places it gently on the table in front of Daniel Carter and David Carter. His voice is calm but serious. "Boys, my name is Michael Harrison." He pauses for a moment, then continues, "And I think the world needs to hear your voices." The twins stare at the card. They don't fully understand what this moment means yet. But the decision Michael Harrison has just made will soon travel far beyond this restaurant, beyond Chicago, beyond the freezing streets where the twins once sang for coins. Because what started as 2 hungry boys asking for leftover food is about to become a story the entire country will hear. But before that can happen, something unexpected will occur the very next morning. Something that almost prevents the world from ever hearing the voices of Daniel Carter and David Carter again. The applause in the restaurant slowly fades as the man steps closer to the small table where Daniel Carter and David Carter are finishing their meal. The room is quieter now, but people are still watching. Curiosity has spread across the entire dining area. Everyone wants to know why this particular man has taken such interest in two homeless boys who walked in from the freezing Chicago night. He stops beside the table and studies the twins for a moment before speaking. His voice is calm, steady, and thoughtful. "Where did you learn to sing like that?" he asks. Daniel Carter looks up first. His eyes show a mixture of caution and politeness. Life on the streets has taught him that adults can be unpredictable, but something about this man's tone feels different. Honest, respectful. He swallows the last bite of food on his plate before answering. "Our mom taught us," he says quietly. David Carter nods beside him. The man listens carefully, giving them his full attention. "Your mother must have been an incredible singer," he replies. The twins glance at each other for a moment, sharing the same memory without needing to speak it out loud. Sunday mornings. Church benches. Their mother standing in the choir, her voice filling the sanctuary while the twins stood beside her trying to match her harmonies. After a moment of silence, the man pulls out the chair across from them and sits down. His presence draws more attention from the surrounding tables. A few guests lean slightly in their seats, pretending not to watch while clearly listening to every word. The man rests his hands on the table and introduces himself in a simple, direct way. "My name is Robert Langston," he says. The twins nod politely, but the name means nothing to them. To Daniel Carter and David Carter, he is simply another stranger in a warm restaurant. But several people nearby react differently. One woman's eyes widen. A man at another table whispers something to his wife. Because although many guests don't immediately recognize the name, others do. In the music industry, Robert Langston is not just another producer. For more than 3 decades, he has worked quietly behind the scenes, shaping some of the biggest voices in American music. His career began in the late 1980s when he helped produce an album that unexpectedly topped the charts. Since then, his work has earned multiple awards, including several Grammys. But what makes Robert Langston truly respected in the industry is something else entirely. His ability to hear raw, unpolished talent and recognize greatness before the rest of the world notices. He has discovered singers performing in tiny bars, church choirs, and community events. Voices that later filled arenas and dominated radio stations. And now he is looking directly at Daniel Carter and David Carter with that same focused attention. "Tell me something," Robert Langston continues. "How long have you boys been singing together?" David Carter answers this time. "Since we were little," he says. "Our mom used to make us practice harmonies every night." The producer nods slowly. That explains what he heard earlier. Perfect instinctive harmony like that rarely appears by accident. It usually comes from years of listening and learning together. "And where do you live?" he asks gently. The question hangs in the air for a moment. Finally, Daniel Carter gives the honest answer. "We don't really have a place right now." Around the restaurant, a few guests shift uncomfortably in their chairs. Robert Langston absorbs the information quietly. He studies the boys more carefully now. Their jackets are thin and worn. Their shoes are scuffed and barely insulated against Chicago winter. These are not children pretending to struggle. These are children who have been surviving on the streets far longer than anyone their age should. The producer leans forward slightly. "How old are you?" he asks. 10, David Carter replies. "Both of us." The man slowly exhales. 10 years old, homeless, and possessing voices capable of silencing a crowded restaurant full of strangers. For several seconds, Robert Langston says nothing. His mind is working through the possibilities. In his long career, he has encountered talented singers many times. But what he heard tonight from Daniel Carter and David Carter was something deeper than technical ability. Their voices carried emotion, experience, pain, and hope mixed together in a way that audiences instinctively connect with. And that kind of authenticity cannot be manufactured in a recording studio. It either exists or it doesn't. In these boys, it clearly does. He finally reaches into his coat pocket and removes a business card. The card is simple. White background, black lettering. The name Robert Langston printed clearly along with a phone number and a small record label logo. He places the card carefully on the table between the twins. "Boys," he says, "I've spent most of my life working in music, and I've heard thousands of singers." Daniel Carter and David Carter watch him quietly, unsure where the conversation is going. Robert Langston continues speaking, his voice calm but serious. "But what you two have is rare." The twins glance at the card again. They still don't fully understand what it represents. To them, it is just another piece of paper from another adult. But to the people around them who recognize the name, that small card represents something far bigger. Opportunity. A door opening where none existed before. Robert Langston stands from the chair and straightens his coat. Before leaving, he looks at the twins one more time. If you're still in Chicago tomorrow, he says gently, I'd like to hear you sing again. Somewhere quieter. He pauses before adding, somewhere the world can really listen. The producer turns and walks back toward his table. Conversations slowly begin again around the restaurant, but something has shifted in the atmosphere. Moments earlier, the twins had been a source of entertainment. Now people are beginning to realize they may have witnessed the beginning of something extraordinary. At their small table near the entrance, Daniel Carter and David Carter finish their meal in thoughtful silence. Neither of them knows exactly who Robert Langston is. Neither of them understands how important this moment may become. But by the following evening, the voices of Daniel Carter and David Carter will begin a journey that no one in that restaurant could have imagined. And the story of two homeless twins who once sang for leftover food will soon travel far beyond the snowy streets of Chicago. The restaurant slowly settles back into its usual rhythm, but the energy in the room has changed. People are still thinking about what they heard from Daniel Carter and David Carter. Some guests continue whispering quietly, glancing toward the small table where the twins sit finishing their meal. For most people in the room, the moment will eventually become just another interesting story they tell later. But for Robert Langston, the man who had been sitting quietly in the corner, the moment feels much larger than that. He stands again from his table and walks back toward the manager near the front counter. The manager straightens immediately when he sees him approaching. There is a different tone of respect now, the kind people use when speaking to someone they recognize as important. Robert Langston nods toward the twins. His voice is calm but firm. Feed them, he says. The manager glances toward the boys, slightly confused. They already ate, he replies quietly. Robert Langston shakes his head gently. I mean, make sure they're taken care of tonight. Whatever they need. The manager nods quickly this time. The message is clear. But Robert Langston is not finished. He walks back to the small table where Daniel Carter and David Carter are sitting. The twins look up again, unsure why he has returned. He pulls the chair closer and sits down across from them once more. The room grows a little quieter again as people begin noticing the conversation continuing. A few guests lean subtly in their seats. Something important seems to be happening. Robert Langston rests his hands together on the table and looks directly at the boys. Tell me something, he says. Have you ever sung anywhere other than the streets? David Carter shakes his head. Just church. When we were younger, he answers. Daniel Carter adds quietly. And sometimes subway stations. The producer nods slowly as he listens. He has already heard enough to understand their story. Two boys who once sang beside their mother in church, now surviving by performing wherever people might spare a few coins. Then Robert Langston asks a question that causes several nearby diners to stop eating and listen more closely. How would you two feel about singing somewhere bigger than this restaurant? The twins stare at him for a moment. They don't respond right away, because they genuinely don't understand what he means. Daniel Carter tilts his head slightly. Bigger, he asks. The producer smiles faintly. Much bigger. The boys exchange another glance. Their entire world has recently been limited to shelters, sidewalks, and cold subway platforms. The idea of something bigger than a restaurant performance feels difficult to imagine. David Carter finally speaks. Like, another place to sing for food? The question hangs in the air for a moment. A few people nearby quietly smile at the innocence of it. Robert Langston shakes his head gently. No, he says. Somewhere people actually come to hear music. The twins still look uncertain. They have no reason to believe opportunities like that exist for children like them. But the producer continues speaking calmly, trying to explain in a way they can understand. I run a recording studio here in Chicago, he tells them. Sometimes we invite singers there. We record their voices, help them share their music with the world. For the first time that evening, Daniel Carter and David Carter look truly surprised. Recording studio. The words sound almost unreal to them. Those are places they have only heard about from other musicians playing on street corners. Places where professional singers make albums and songs that play on the radio. David Carter glances down at the business card still resting on the table. The name Robert Langston printed across the front suddenly feels more important. But why us? Daniel Carter asks quietly. The question is sincere. The producer does not answer immediately. Instead, he thinks carefully about the simplest and most honest response. Then he says something that will stay with the twins for the rest of their lives. Because I've spent my entire career listening for voices like yours, Robert Langston explains. And tonight I heard something special. Around the restaurant, several people continue pretending not to watch, but their attention remains fixed on the conversation. They sense they may be witnessing the beginning of something meaningful. Robert Langston reaches into his pocket again and pulls out a small folded piece of paper. This time it isn't a business card. It's a note with an address written on it. He slides the paper toward the twins. Tomorrow morning, he says, come to this address. It's my studio. If you sing there the way you sang tonight, we'll figure out the next step together. Daniel Carter picks up the note carefully, as if it might disappear. Neither boy fully understands how important that address might become. The producer stands once more and looks down at them with a thoughtful expression. Get some rest tonight, he adds gently. You've got a big day tomorrow. Then he turns and walks back toward the exit of the restaurant. Several guests watch him leave. Others look toward the twins again, wondering what will happen next. At the small table near the entrance, Daniel Carter and David Carter sit quietly with the note resting between them. Just a few hours earlier, they had walked into the restaurant hoping to earn leftover food by singing a single song. Now they are holding an invitation that could completely change their future. But what happens the next morning will determine whether the voices of Daniel Carter and David Carter remain echoes on cold city streets, or become something the entire country will soon hear. The following morning arrives colder than the night before. Snow still covers the sidewalks of Chicago, and the air carries that sharp winter bite that makes breathing feel heavy. But Daniel Carter and David Carter wake up with something they haven't felt in a long time. Hope. The small piece of paper with the studio address is still folded carefully inside Daniel Carter's jacket pocket. Neither of them slept very much the night before. Too many questions filled their minds. Was Robert Langston serious? Would he really be waiting for them? Or was it simply one of those promises adults sometimes make and forget the next day? By late morning, the twins stand outside a modest brick building on a quiet street in Chicago. The sign above the door reads Langston Sound Studios. The building doesn't look glamorous. It doesn't resemble the luxurious music studios they have imagined in their minds. But to Daniel Carter and David Carter, it feels like stepping into another world. They hesitate for a moment before pushing the door open. Inside, the warmth of the building immediately replaces the freezing air outside. A young assistant at the front desk looks up, surprised to see two thin boys standing there with snow on their jackets. Before she can ask a question, a familiar voice speaks from down the hallway. You made it. It's Robert Langston. He walks toward them with a small smile, clearly pleased they came. The twins relax slightly when they see him again. The producer leads them down the hallway into a recording room filled with microphones, instruments, and sound equipment. For boys who spent weeks singing on cold street corners, the room feels almost unbelievable. Let's hear you again, Robert Langston says gently. The twins glance at each other, just as they always do before singing. That silent exchange between them has been part of their lives since childhood. Then they step toward the microphone, and they begin. The same harmony that silenced a restaurant the night before now fills the studio. Clear, pure, emotional. When the final note fades, Robert Langston simply nods slowly. The expression on his face confirms what he already believed. These boys are something special. But instead of rushing them into contracts or performances, the producer makes a different decision. One that surprises many people later. First, he helps them find a safe place to live. A small apartment arranged through a local family assistance program. For the first time in months, Daniel Carter and David Carter sleep in real beds. Next, he ensures they return to school. The twins are enrolled in a nearby public school where teachers quickly notice their quiet personalities and strong bond with each other. Then comes vocal training. Not harsh lessons or intense pressure, but patient guidance from experienced vocal coaches who help them strengthen and protect the voices they already possess. Robert Langston understands something important about young talent. If you push too hard too fast, the pressure can destroy what makes it special in the first place. Weeks pass, and slowly, word about the twins begins to spread. At first, it's just a local story. A small Chicago newspaper runs an article about two homeless boys discovered singing in a restaurant. The story includes a short video clip recorded by a diner that night. The internet notices immediately. Within days, the video spreads across social media. People share it with captions filled with disbelief and admiration. Listen to these boys. Unbelievable voices. From homeless to hopeful. Soon local television stations begin calling Robert Langston, asking for interviews. They want to meet Daniel Carter and David Carter. They want to hear the voices everyone online is talking about. The first news interview happens inside the same studio where the twins recorded their first song. Cameras capture them sitting quietly beside each other, answering questions in soft voices. Viewers across Chicago are deeply moved by their story. Two identical twins, raised in a musical home, losing their father, losing their home, losing their mother, then surviving on the streets by singing. The story spreads quickly beyond Chicago. National news networks begin covering it. Morning talk shows invite them to perform. People across the country hear about the Carter twins who once asked a restaurant manager for leftover food in exchange for a song. Donations begin arriving. Letters from strangers. Support from musicians who admire their talent and resilience. But something unexpected happens as the attention grows. Journalists start asking the twins a familiar question. What does it feel like to become famous? Each time the question comes up, Daniel Carter and David Carter look slightly confused. Because in their minds, they were never chasing fame. They were never dreaming about television appearances or headlines. Their dream was always something much simpler. And when the twins finally explain what they truly want most, their answer surprises everyone watching. Because the one thing Daniel Carter and David Carter hope for is something many people listening to their story already take for granted. As the weeks pass, the lives of Daniel Carter and David Carter continue to change in ways they never imagined. The small apartment arranged through the assistance program becomes their first real home in months. Their school days slowly return to something resembling normal life. Teachers notice how closely the twins stay together, how they quietly support each other in every situation. And inside Robert Langston's studio, their voices grow stronger with each lesson. The national attention surrounding their story continues to spread. Interviews, television appearances, online videos watched by millions of people. Everywhere they go, people are amazed by the journey of two homeless boys who walked into a Chicago restaurant asking to sing for leftover food and ended up being discovered by a legendary producer. But something about the attention never quite feels comfortable to Daniel Carter and David Carter. They are grateful. They are polite. They answer every question respectfully. Yet when reporters ask about fame, record deals, or future albums, the twins often exchange the same quiet glance before responding. It's the same look they share before every song. Because the truth is simple. The things exciting everyone else are not the things the twins think about the most. One afternoon, several months after that winter night in Chicago, Robert Langston sits with them inside the recording studio. The training session has just ended, and the boys are resting in the chairs near the microphone stand where they have spent so many hours practicing. The producer studies them for a moment. He has worked with many young singers over the years, and most of them react very differently when attention arrives. Fame usually excites people. It pushes them forward. But with Daniel Carter and David Carter, he senses something else. They remain humble, quiet, focused more on the music itself than on the attention surrounding it. Finally, David Carter speaks. His voice is careful, almost hesitant. "Mr. Langston, can we ask you something?" The producer nods. Of course. The twins glance at each other again, silently deciding who will speak first. Then Daniel Carter asks the question that has been on their minds for weeks. "Do you think we could sing in church again?" For a moment, Robert Langston doesn't answer. Not because the question is difficult, but because it surprises him. After everything that has happened, the interviews, the attention, the growing interest from music companies, the one thing these boys want most is not a stage or a spotlight. They want a church. They want the place where their love for music first began, where their mother once stood beside them in the choir, where the three of them used to sing together every Sunday morning. The producer slowly smiles. "Yeah," he says softly. "I think we can make that happen." A few weeks later, on a quiet Sunday morning, a church on the south side of Chicago fills with people. Word has spread that the Carter twins will be singing there that day. Some people in the audience know their story from the news. Others are simply members of the church community curious to hear the voices everyone has been talking about. The choir gathers at the front of the sanctuary. Among them stand Daniel Carter and David Carter. Their clothes are simple but clean. Their posture is slightly nervous, but their eyes carry something new. Peace. The church grows silent as the music begins. Then the twins start singing. The same kind of harmony that once silenced a crowded restaurant now fills the sanctuary. Warm, pure, emotional. But this time it feels different. Because this is the place where their voices first learned to rise together. This is the place where their mother once taught them the song they are singing now. And as Daniel Carter and David Carter reach the final notes, their voices blend perfectly with the choir behind them. For the first time in years, standing in that church, singing the same song their mother once shared with them, the twins feel something they thought they had lost forever. They feel like they are home again. Stories like this remind us how quickly people can make assumptions. On that cold winter night in Chicago, when Daniel Carter and David Carter first pushed open the restaurant door, most of the room saw only two homeless boys in thin jackets asking for leftover food. Some people laughed. Others reached for their phones, expecting a quick moment of entertainment before returning to their meals. Very few people in that room expected to witness something meaningful. But sometimes life hides its most powerful moments in ordinary places. A crowded restaurant. A cold evening. Two hungry children asking for a chance to sing. And yet, within seconds, the laughter disappeared. Conversations stopped. An entire room full of strangers fell silent as the voices of Daniel Carter and David Carter filled the space with something honest and unforgettable. Sometimes the world laughs at people who appear to have nothing. But talent, hope, and courage have a way of revealing themselves when we least expect it. The truth is, greatness does not always arrive dressed in success or recognition. Sometimes it arrives quietly, carrying the weight of hardship, waiting for someone to notice what others overlook. On that night, while many people laughed, one person chose to listen. Robert Langston heard something that others nearly missed. And because he listened, two boys who once sang on freezing street corners found a path back to a future they never thought possible. Today, Daniel Carter and David Carter are no longer standing outside restaurants hoping someone might offer them leftover food. They are back in school. They have a safe place to live. And their voices continue to grow stronger with every passing day. But perhaps the most important part of their story is not the attention they received or the opportunities that followed. It is the simple reminder that every person we meet carries a story we cannot see. Every stranger has a history. Every voice has a place where it began. And sometimes, all it takes to change a life is one moment of kindness. And one person willing to truly listen. Now think about that moment again. Two hungry boys walk into a warm restaurant. They ask to sing for leftover food. People laugh. But then the music begins. And everything changes. So here's a question for you. What would you have done if Daniel Carter and David Carter walked into your restaurant that night? Would you have laughed like the others? Or would you have listened? Let us know your thoughts in the comments. And if this story moved you, don't forget to subscribe for more powerful real-life stories.